The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. First, initial checks. Can you guys please confirm through the questions window if you can hear me, just to double check that my audio is working well? All right, good. So having confirmation, let's get this started right away. Okay, so as part of the webinar series that we're running on the subject of collaboration through IFC files with ArchiCAD and other applications, we're sort of rounding up today's webinar, which is our fourth webinar on the subject of setting up a project. So in this case, we're going to talk about setting up a project. So the initial steps, we did talk about, just as a recap, we did talk about project location and how important that is to make sure that all files will fall in the same place and fix that on the go if necessary. All right. Again, my name is Nando Mogollon. I'm a digital design consultant with Central Innovation. For any future webinars, please subscribe so you don't miss them. At least you get a reminder if you don't have the time to attend. These webinars will be recorded and you can access those through my CI. Just to make it easier, just scan that QR code on the screen and your phone will help you getting through the website straight away. Since we have these short webinars in fairly short period of time, we split the webinars in two so that we run a Q&A session on 1 week, on the week after we do the presentation. So today is going to be part 3, and the Q&A session will be in next week. So if you have any questions, please write those questions on the questions panel. If we don't have time to sort those questions out today, we'll definitely get through those next week. Today we're going to focus on 3 main things, all of them based on the idea of making sure that you have regular and consistent model exchanges when you're exporting your files from ArchiCAD. And that depends on mainly 3 things. The kind of file format you're going to export. In IFC, the IFC itself comes in different flavors. IFC, IFCZip, or a compressed mode of the IFC, and the IFCXML. Then you have everything that happens within the publisher inside ArchiCAD, which is probably the best way for you to guarantee that you'll have some sort of consistency in terms of content, but also in terms of translation. And then based on translation, we want to take a look at the other side of the publisher, which is those translators that you want to use to export those files. At the second point, we're also going to take a brief look on what we're going to do next in the next sessions, which is starting the model federation, that is, building up a series of multiple models to build up a project file. So without any further ado, let's go straight away and jump into ArchiCAD so we see what we're going to do today. So if you saw the previous webinars, you're aware that this is the building we're using. It's fairly, simplistic shell. There's not much content to it. And we're just using it for the sake of giving us an example with multiple stories and some sort of a complex geometry rather than having a simple little house. So this is the file we have. This is kind of the complete view of the model, if you like. And then following the previous weeks, we want to start exporting this by using IFC in one of its different formats and doing that through the publisher with the help of translators. So let's take one step at a time. When you export this file as an IFC, say if you use a very rough method of simply export as, you'll see that you have several options here, mainly these 4. There are basically 2 of them, but I want to focus on the main difference between these two. You'll have an extension called plain IFC or IFC, and then another one called IFCXML. Now, those two are different file formats, although they contain similar information. They both consider IFC, since IFC is the schema or the structure of the information, but the form or format is different. The difference between these two resides mainly in the capacity of either format to describe not only the building elements, but their relationships. In general, IFC, it's a plain schema based on something called Express. And that type of format, it's expressly defined, expressly set for building information. XML, it's an open format that, although far more widely adopted, it's not capable of doing or describing certain relationships in between the building elements. All in all, it is more often recommended for you to use IFC instead of IFCXML. When will you use IFCXML? There are situations where some software cannot take raw IFC, but can take XML, since it is more widely adopted by other pieces of software. Which kind of pieces of software? XML, it's mostly used for grid building or energy analysis. It's also used for light analysis. So it might be the case that XML might be used in that case. Other than that, if you ever export the two and you want to see what the difference is, let me cancel this since I already have exported a couple of files like those. So what you will expect to have is something like this. This file here and this file here are exactly the same. They are both export of the same geometry, same content. But the raw IFC file, it's only 16 megabytes, while the XML version of the same file, it's up to 73 megabytes. So format does change the file size, since the structure, the way the software is written, it's different. Now, for those of you who are interested on, geeking out and see what's inside that, I've also got these two comparisons here. That is actually the code inside those two files. The one on the left is the same content in the raw IFC format. So you see it's a matter of form. The shape itself is different to the one in XML, which is the one on the right. And this one on the right is basically the same XML file, but rather on a structured way, which is the XML format itself. This is just for the sake of you to have an idea of how is that different. In practical terms, the main difference based on the concept of having certain relationships to be applied to one another. So for the following exercise, we're going to keep using IFC, not IFCXML. And the other two formats that are IFCZip or IFCXML-zip, they're just basically compressed forms of the same file. There's no mystery there. It's the same thing as if you were just zipping the file outside with any application. All right, so we've got that. That's our model. Let's take a look at the publisher. So at any point in time, you can always export an IFC file simply by going through File, Save As, and then choose the IFC. But that cannot guarantee that every single time that you export, and you will have to export your files very regularly, you're going to have the same content and in the same shapes. So you want to do that through your publishers. Now, let me go through the publisher here. So you will notice that what I have here and what it's recommended is to have a single publisher to handle most of your model exports, especially for IFC cases. So what I have in there, if I double click on that, it's a folder that is a shortcut. So let's go and open the organizer so that that can be explained a little bit clearer. What I really have is a shortcut to an IFC folder that I have on the view map. So the view map I have already a folder for model exchange and coordination where I have divided for information that is going out for export and the stuff that is coming in. So for export, I have DWG, which is very common, IFCs, and GBXML, which is for, as I was mentioning, energy analysis. Let's keep it with IFC. And this folder is the one that I have added a shortcut to the exporter in the publishing. That one will read any files that I drop, or sorry, any views that I drop into this view map folder, and they'll be replicated already there. The only thing that I've added additional to that was make sure that they have a project number and a revision number, that it's automated there. If you don't know how to get that done, I'll share some links with you later on. But basically what's happening is I already have, move it here to the side, I already have set a number of views, like so, to make sure that only what I can see in those views will be exported. I've chosen in this particular case for this exercise 3D views, but it can just as well be done from a floor plan view. All right, so I've got 3 of them, and that's where we're going to start building up what we call a federated model with different contents for different purposes. And I have 3 different file types at the moment. I have my architectural file for coordination. What I will include in here is pretty much everything that is in the scope of our contract, mainly architectural items that we have some level of authority on. That's the one that we're going to combine with the other models to build up a complete federated model. Now, as you saw in the initial 2 webinars, we also wanted to create a project location file. In this particular case, we're following the idea of having a project location in local coordinates, not world coordinates, just to facilitate the exchange of files, making sure that they all fall in the same location without too much trouble, not dealing with models far, far away from origin. Additionally, just because it's a relatively good practice now that not everyone is up to speed with handling their software in a particular good way, we have also included these cubes or cuboids with that are aligned with the location, the origin location of our georeference point. Basically, that will be the IFC 0 for every story. We have also included these 2 grid lines just to make sure that everyone has the building in the same place. That typically is good practice and can be updated as the project continues. The whole idea of having the grid lines in place will be to locate horizontally the building in the right location. And then every single cuboid will make sure that this IFC file will export also every single story at the right elevation. So that's a file that anyone else in the team can use as a reference and mimic both the project location and the setup of stories, making sure that everyone's got the URLs correctly. So that's another file that I'm going to export in here. I'm not going to include anything but that because that's going to be a different export and a different rates of updates. And then just because I have it with my file and we're assuming that we're going to start the exchange of files in this particular project, I also have the context of the project or the bits and pieces of the landscape that, although are not part of my scope, they serve as a reference to keep things in place and in the right context. I've also included here, similar to the cuboid, these thin, they're actually 1 millimeter thick walls. I built that with the wall tool, but I have classified that as building element proxies, basically IFC objects, not walls themselves, to replicate the property or the boundary lines. That's going to serve as a reference for me for double check things in those IFC files, building them up in in an IFC coordination software. All right, there's no more, complexity to this. There's no more elements to that. It's somewhat a simplified type of model, but it will be the same if it was just more complex, just adding more items, but the idea is exactly the same. So I've got these three files. I have the architectural model for coordination, only the stuff that it's in scope for architectural design, site and context, and the reference file for project location. Those three will be exported as an IFC inside the publisher. And that only takes, bringing that as a shortcut, as I mentioned before, and selecting the file format as IFC file. What I want to do, though, is select different translators for them because they necessarily will need different both model, geometry, and model information requirements. So if I select every one of them, you'll see that this one here has a translator with a specific name that I have coded with the project number and the name that is dedicated for that one file. I've got another one for the site and context. It's a dedicated translator. And the architecture for coordination, it's a dedicated translator. So let's go and take a look at how those translators have been set up. And the importance of this is that then you know that on one side, you don't have to remember which translator did you use the last time because it's already been set. So dedicated translators are always recommended. And you will know that you can simply select either the entire group or just the elements that the different files you need to export and hit publish only the selected items. That's going to guarantee that every single time you export those files, you're going to get a fairly similar or consistent result. Now let's go and take a look at the translators because we want to talk about the last talking point that I have for today, which is the presets on those dedicated translators. Okay, number one, I've got and I have created different translators for export, not for import yet, since that's a different process that we're going to talk about later in future webinars. But for export, I've dedicated individual translators for every single model. Those translators basically will define two things: the schema or version, if you like, of the IFC. In this case, I'm using 2x3 just as an example. I'd like to use 4, but at this point in time, it just serves the purpose of doing this exercise. And because the files that we're initiating right now are for the purpose of federating a model or coordinating a model with other disciplines, I've chosen the model view definition to be coordination view to start with. That's the one you want to use for that purpose. The model view definition basically defines different relationships inside the elements and different hierarchies of different type of elements. Maybe we don't have the time to get into the details of that, but they're basically a few model view definitions that are already been defined by Building Smart. That's why they're included in here, so you don't have to build it yourself. You just can rely on the basic definition of those, and you will expect that both the IFC schema, either 2x3 or 4, and the model view definitions for every purpose will be required or will be explicitly written down inside the BIM execution plan. If there is no BIM execution plan, it will be nice at least to have a single page of general agreements on the schema that is going to be used and the view definition. Then everything else, every other preset that we have in here, although it's not strictly part of the model view definition, they just need to sort of align with those model view definitions. But the software will tell you when those are not quite aligned. So the three things that you probably want to pay a lot of attention when building up these different translators will be, on one side, the model filtering. Now, in this particular case, because I have views that are already filtering things in out, I didn't worry about those, but you can actually choose to filter or to give you a prompt to filter things as you are exporting them. You can also preset the filtering when things are slightly more complex. So that's one. Type mapping, very important, although it's so important that we're gonna dedicate a specific webinar just on the topic of type mapping, which is basically making a translation in between ArchiCAD tools and classifications to IFC common entities. And then you have the geometry conversion, for which I do have a dedicated preset so that I can manipulate that separate from any of the translators. That's the one that is gonna explicitly tell ArchiCAD to write an IFC that locates the model either on the survey position point or the project origin. And since we're using survey point, we're going to choose that. It also defines the geometry either by being boundary representation or by being CSG or constructed solid geometries. That's typically extruded or sweeps, as explicitly are described in there. And a few other things like exporting the geometries that are geometries, meaning the actual building materials that are participating in collision detection. So all of those items in the hierarchy of several different elements inside ArchiCAD, mainly system tools, curtain wall states, and railings. So the granularity and type of geometry needs to be defined by this geometry conversion, and you want to make sure that you use a dedicated preset for that. Takes nothing, takes a few minutes just to create a new one with the name and purpose of that one IFC file. And the same thing will be for the data conversion. So both geometry and data can be controlled separately. In here, you will decide which kind of data are you exporting. Data is important when it's necessary, but when it's not required, it can be simply bloating the files unnecessarily. So I've created basic data, which I'm exporting almost nothing for the sake of different purposes in here. Project location doesn't require much data. The architectural file does require data according to the BIM execution plan. So that one, for instance, I've added classifications, I've added base quantities, and the properties that I have mapped in Translator. Same thing for the other two. So they all have dedicated presets, and it is advised that you do that so you don't mess up any other translators on the fly. So that will do that, and that's going to guarantee that every time that I export, I will get some sort of consistent outcome. Now, the only thing you need to do from that point, as with any other publisher, will be just to hit publish. That's going to give you a few files, which I have already pre-cooked for you to see there, so we don't waste time doing that, but will be the same if I just do it now. And I have 3 files. I have the file that I use for reference, the project location, which I'm using local coordinate systems, and the site, which is going to also be shared in the architectural file for coordination. So let's jump ahead, and I'm going to show you what did I get when I moved that to Solibri. It could be the same if you do that with any other viewer, but I'm using Solibri in this particular case. So what I've got in here is, let's go one by one. I have the single architectural file. So the same that you saw there, that I have it inside this folder just for architectural stuff in case I have another, maybe an interior design file or something like that. So that'll be, just a regular file with all the stories and all the content inside there. And then I have these reference models, one of them being the, sorry, let's use these ones first. The project location file, which contains, it's bringing in grid lines from the other files, but never mind. These contain the 2 grid lines 1 and A, and every single cuboid that I've used for the sake of locating and creating those stories. So you can just double check if you see the contents of that particular file. It actually contains all the placeholders for all those stories. And the same thing for the side. Now let's take a quick look at the side, because it's a particular one, since side geometry doesn't behave exactly the same in IFC as building geometry. So what I've got in this file is a side that will show up, and this is important for you to know so that it avoids frustrations. Let me take this and minimize that. And, right. What you will see is that the side geometry gets displayed in most software when you hit or click on the side itself. Now, the side itself may not display a division of different items. Like I have that road in there, I have the general side, and I also have the walkway around my building and a pad that I have surrounding the building itself. That's not explicitly displayed in there since it's supposed to be just for reference. If you've got a civil or a landscape file that's required to be there and modeled, then that will be replacing this file. In my case, it's not in the scope, so I'm just using that as a reference. What I do have, and I have included in this file, is the property line of the building. That's the one that I think you remember I was modeling with those thin walls. And I've created a group for those, which we'll describe that in, I believe it's on webinar 5 or 6. Creating a group for the property boundaries. So that is that line in there, which we intentionally make taller, just to make sure that it's visible and can be measured from and to if necessary, right? And that's the one that will explicitly be translated as property boundaries as a single group of items. And they're not walls, they're actually just objects, since they don't need to have any building, any definition for a building entity. So in that way, I can simply take any of the files and use that as a reference if in need for me to measure things from the building to the side of the property line if that was necessary, right? So that's how you start building up that, and you will by means of having the specific translators and specific publisher for those, you'll guarantee that every single time as you keep making changes to the model, they'll just update the same content that will be translated with the same properties and same requirements. All right. Don't seem to have too many questions already coming in. So if you guys have any questions, please let me know. If there are no questions, we're still going to be running a Q&A session the next time where we're going to explore in detail just a few items regarding the presets inside the translators. For anything else, you always have access to the technical team getting help on the Australia and New Zealand email addresses that you see on the screen. For anything else, you can give us a call on the numbers on the screen for both Australia and New Zealand. Thank you very much for your time, guys. And if, again, don't miss the Q&A webinar on next week at the same time, and we'll see you here. Please remember to jump into my CI if you want to re-watch the recording of this webinar, which should be up there by tomorrow this time. All right, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.